Good morning. Welcome to Corporate PPAs within a wider net zero context. Today we're going to be covering obviously corporate PPAs and looking at the net zero journey in general. Just some general housekeeping. You're welcome. You'll hear from GridBeyond. Neil and Gareth will speak, and then we go on to Joy from AstraZeneca to give her perspective from an end user. And what we're going to do, we're asking for questions because then we're going to a panel discussion, and obviously we welcome your input. So do ask questions throughout, and I'll then towards the end I'll put them to the panel. The presentations will be made available to you after the webinar today. So you'll be able to download that from the Energyst. You'll get sent a link. So without further ado, power purchase agreements. They provide financial uncertainty to you and the project developer. It removes a significant roadblock to building new renewable facilities. But what are the challenges? What are the emerging opportunities to lock in clean power? And crucially, how do PPAs fit within the wider net zero context? Formulating comprehensive energy strategies to enable the transition to net zero economy is almost impossible without the use of PPAs to drive the development of renewable energy. But how does this sit alongside plans that involve flexibility, on-site generation, battery storage, and energy efficiency? Firstly, we're going to hear from Joy Vickers, not firstly, but she will give a view. She's the Associate Director of Global Energy Procurement at AstraZeneca. Also, Neil Garland, Head of Origination at GridBeyond. But kicking us off is Gareth Ball, Head of Solar and Storage at GridBeyond. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you, Tim. Great to be on the webinar today. Thanks for everyone for joining us. I'm just going to talk briefly a little bit about who GridBeyond are. Net zero, what does it mean in the context of scope 2 reductions, and just some information around CPPAs, but also other technologies that you might want to consider deploying on site to really make as big an impact as you can on reducing your scope 2 emissions. Next slide, please, if you would. Thank you. So just repeating briefly what Tim said, but I'm going to be talking first. Neil, my colleague, is going to be going in a little bit more detail about CPPAs, and Joy's going to bring us home at the end and discuss exactly a real-world example of what AstraZeneca have been doing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who are GridBeyond? Essentially, GridBeyond are a smart energy company. Since we began operating in 2010, we have three key goals at our business, and it's to accelerate companies towards their renewable energy goals, their targets, reduce their cost of power, and also along the way try to unlock new revenue streams that they might not have considered in the past via energy flexibility on site. And on that point, to date, I think we have just over 2.3, approximately 2.4 gigawatts worth of load under management, assets under management, and 500 megawatts of batteries that we optimize and enter into various markets to generate revenue for businesses as well. I think one of the biggest changes, rather, that the business has seen is our sphere of operation. We've gone from a UK and Irish-based market-based business, if you like, and that remains our largest market to date. But we've expanded over into the US, where we have also gone into Canada, I believe, recently. But Australia is one of our quickest growing markets, along with Japan as well. Hopefully in the next not too distant future, that footprint will grow further as we look to expand our business. We've got over 160 employees now, which is fantastic, and again, from where the business was 2 years ago, is exponential growth. And some of the key services that are relevant, again, in the context of today's call, are around obviously CPPAs, sourcing and procurement, distributed energy asset procurement and management, so think on-site solar and battery storage as well, renewable energy asset optimization, and EV fleet management, which is again a really exciting space at the moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So completely understand there'll be a lot of experts on the call today, but just to make this kind of this session as inclusive as possible, just to distinguish what is classed as net zero or what is net zero. So net zero signifies achieving an equilibrium or a balance between the production and the removal of greenhouse gases or GHGs in the atmosphere. And how we attain this balance is by employing a mixture of emission reduction and emission removal strategies. Now, the context of the call today is specifically around scope 2. There are 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. And scope 2's definition is classed as an indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, predominantly from the grid. The significance of scope 2 emissions, even though they're considered indirect, they're still considered something or an element of control that a business has over their scope 2 emissions. So they can become more energy efficient, for example. They can just use less power by becoming more efficient in their production timelines and schedules and processes as well. And also, obviously tying in with today's call, they have a big say and choice over where their energy is procured from, be it just from the grid or from a renewable energy source like a wind or solar farm as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a quick nod, this is a very, very busy slide indeed, but many of you might be aware or will be aware of SBTI, which is Science Based Target Initiative. And this is a snip directly from their Getting Started guide. Now, SBTI, for those that don't know, it essentially provides a rigorous science-based framework for emissions reduction targets, which essentially are aligned to the science or latest latest climate science and the goals of the Paris Agreement is what we're looking at here. Now, by participating in SBTI, companies and businesses demonstrating their commitment to a credible and accountable climate action. So really what this does is it provides a framework for companies to work against, to really map out their journey and understand what they have to do to get from where they are at the moment to the end goal of net zero. And what I wanted to highlight here was, I've circled in red, is just around, or specifically around, renewable energy, which is scope 2 only. And there's 2 types of target that we're looking at here. Companies can sign up or choose to sign up to become either 80% renewable energy by 2025 or 100% renewable energy by 2030. So this is what we call a near-term target. Now, in the context of today's call, this is important because CPPAs, and one of the advantages CPPAs provide, is the most auditable and transparent methodology of procuring renewable energy, especially when you keep the REGOs, which Neil will delve into recently. And it's really classed as the gold standard, which is important when we're considering kind of stakeholders within business and shareholders and customers alike. They really look for companies that are being as proactive and transparent as possible to prove and show and demonstrate that they're committed to their net zero goals. Next slide, please. Thank you. What I'd like to illustrate on this slide here is what a layered approach looks like. So obviously, this call is centered around CPPAs, and CPPAs are fantastic because you can make a huge chunk and have a large impact, if you like, on reducing your CO2 emissions and scope 2 emissions. But there are multiple options and different strategies to be able to get there and actually reach your goals. So what this chart demonstrates, or illustrates rather, is how a combination of on-site solar, both long-term and medium-term PPAs, and a battery can do to help a business achieve their goals. So along the bottom here with on-site solar, this particular customer has covered 8% of their load via on-site solar, and that's now hedged as well. But they've also decided to layer in a 10-year PPA on top of that. So they've gone now, they've added an additional 30% of their load from a renewable energy project that's backed. They've got the REGOs, it's there, it's hedged as well. They've also decided to layer in 5-year block CPPAs. It might be an existing renewable energy source, which has got them up to a complete hedged position of 68%. Now, this particular customer has decided to keep the remaining 32% of their load on the index price, basically. Now, there are risks associated with buying energy in this way, and especially as we've all seen over the last couple of years, those spikes can be quite significant and have a really negative impact on your bottom lines as well. So for this 32% hedged energy, index energy here, the customer has also installed on-site battery storage. And what that battery enables clients or customers or large consumers to do is really avoid price spikes. So when the market trades at above a predetermined margin, if you like, or area or price, rather than buy that energy from the grid, the customer will discharge the battery into their site and avoid that spike. So therefore, they're using power that they paid a lot less for, rather than importing power at a very high price. But again, what the key takeaway from here is that there's a combination. It's a layered approach from getting from kind of your starting point, if you like, to your end position of such and such or X amount of hedged energy and renewable energy. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just to finish off for myself here, similar to the previous slide, but just kind of another illustration of a real world example. So this particular customer that we're talking here, it's based in Ireland, and it's a 5 megawatt consumer. They have a 5 megawatt site load here. And what we're trying to illustrate is where they started from, which is over in the first box on the top left-hand side, to where they ended up, which is box number 4 on the bottom right. So what they started to do, their starting point was just buying grid energy. And the energy mix in this particular location on site consisted of a renewable energy component of 34% from the grid and a non-renewable energy component of 66%. They hadn't hedged any because they were just buying from the grid. But their first step in this customer journey was to install solar. So they went from a renewable position of 34% to actually now consuming 42% of their load via a renewable energy source. They've also increased their hedge now to 13% of their load. The next step in this customer's journey, or this client's journey, was to then install or secure rather a CPPA, so an off-site power purchase agreement, either with a wind or solar farm or whatever the case, or in most cases a mixture of the two to make sure it's the right fit for their business. So they secured a 3 megawatts CPPA, and their renewable energy position jumped dramatically from 42% to 77%, along with their hedge position to 73%. So this has made a huge impact in their scope 2 emissions, and also their hedging position is substantially increased as well. Now, the final position, or the final step rather, for this particular user was to then install a battery. And what the battery enabled them to do was basically capture overspill from either the on-site generation from solar or from the CPPA or the renewable energy source. And installing a battery here was kind of the icing on the cake. It was the final piece of the puzzle. And they went from a renewable energy component of 77% up to 86%, and the hedged energy component from 73 to 82. And again, kind of the key takeaway here is that I think, generally speaking, what we've seen in the marketplace is that businesses need a really, or businesses that take a fragmented approach tend to get fragmented results. And having a holistic strategy over a sort of short, medium and long term is really where we see businesses make the biggest impact on their scope 2 reductions and really hit their targets in as quick a time frame as possible. But thank you. That's all from myself at this stage. I'll hand you over to Neil, who will talk and do a bit more of a deep dive, if you like, into the CPPA world.
Thank you, Gareth. I appreciate that. So I thought it actually worthwhile just defining exactly what we mean by CPPA. I find that some people do get very confused by acronyms. Of course, this industry loves a good acronym. So CPPA is, in my words, a bilaterally negotiated contract between a renewable electricity producer and a corporate buyer. That's usually for a long term and at a fixed price. The key in the CPPA is the C, the corporate. They need to be directly involved. And also, importantly, as Gareth mentioned earlier on, they also need to be the beneficiary of the REGO. Next slide, please. So what I've done the next couple of slides is I've tried to provide an overview of the main kinds of CPPAs that exist. There are other flavours out there, I'm sure, and as time moves on, things get more and more diverse. But starting off, the one that a lot of people may recognise, it's the most sort of prevalent one in the GB market, is in Great Britain, is a sleeved CPPA. Now, you'll notice the word physical is also in there. It's actually a physical supply agreement, and that's important because basically an energy supply is needed in the middle to manage physical delivery, settlement and billing of the energy. As I said before, more common in this market than overseas. If you go to the US and Europe, you tend to find that virtual PPAs are more common, and that's something I'll go into next. Probably more, it speaks more to the diverse grid structures overseas. And in terms of the process and what happens here, there's a lot to take here on this slide, but I'll sort of walk you through it. So first of all, a corporate contracts with a generator for an agreed level of power and REGOs and an agreed price. Then the corporate then ports or sleeves, as the title states, the CPPA price and volume into their import supply deal. And that effectively becomes a hedge under that agreement. The key factor here, which some people may see as a con, is you need to have capacity in that agreement, so in your position to actually sleeve that volume in. And if you don't, then you need to make sure you do at some point in the future. And another potential downside is the supplier, when they've actually taken on board that agreement, they will pass on a cost to the buyer, which is known as a sleeving fee, and that will be to cover things like, for example, the management of the contract, the volume and the price, and also any imbalance trade that needs to be done, because inherently the technology that is being sleeved is probably from solar or wind. There'll be a profile challenge there, and the supplier will pass that cost on to the end user. So that's a CPPA, a physical CPPA in a nutshell. If you can get the next slide for me, please. So the next one is a virtual CPPA. So unlike a physical sleeved PPA, this is not a physical agreement. That's why sometimes it's referred to as a synthetic CPPA or financial. The financial part I'll come back to actually. And the process is as follows. So again, a corporate contracts with a generator at agreed price for the power and REGOs, and also volume, of course. Now, the key thing here actually, and why it's different to the previous one, is the power price actually is a strike price. So what happens there is effectively it's a price potentially set for the whole contract, but it's reconciled every month, and that's done against a wholesale market price index. Now, to give you an illustration, if the index price is higher than the strike price, then the seller will pay the corporate the difference. If the index price is lower than the strike price, the buyer will pay the seller. That basically gets the parties back to the fixed price that they set out to achieve. Now, an advantage of a virtual CPPA is that it's independent of the corporate and the generator's physical supply arrangements, but those still need to exist. Potential downsides, there are a number of these actually, with a virtual agreement. One, the volume and price is not integrated into the corporate's import trading position. That may be a downside to some, to others it may not be. Some people believe actually virtual PPAs, due to the fact it's not a physical supply agreement, can't be counted as truly additional types of energy. So in other words, because the electrons aren't flowing directly to or via the grid to the given site and managed to the supplier, it's dealt with through some other kind of model, of course. And additionally, an important thing to consider as well is virtual CPPAs are classed as a financial derivative. So that means you have to treat them as such by using specialist accounting treatment, such as through schemes like EMIR. Next slide, please. A question that many of us ponder in the industry is is energy truly green and auditable? And as we move into the future, I guess, we're getting more into kind of where is our energy coming from? Is it truly traceable and green in all its glory? So those who've been in the industry for a while and maybe still do this will know that traditional sort of off-the-shelf green products often are cited as being REGO backed, and the certificates which are being bought on behalf of the corporate, they're provided on an annual basis. That approach is outdated. I think many of us would agree with that. The REGOs may bear no relationship with the actual electricity produced and supplied, so there's a risk of greenwashing there, and the corporate doesn't get them. So the supplier actually retains them, which diminishes the link between the supply and the buyer. And because, as Gareth said earlier on, of the push for net zero and everyone trying to robustly demonstrate where their energy comes from and it's truly green, we're advocating for a more granular and traceable approach, which includes 24/7 power matching, as Gareth mentioned earlier on, through a combination of different solutions, including corporate PPAs. That energy needs to be from the same grid. You need to have the REGOs from the actual source, which a CPPA can also offer for traceability purposes, and also doing a CPPA with the things as well will provide a natural hedge against market volatility as well. Next slide, please. Question I'm often asked actually is, does a CPPA provide good value? I think at the moment it probably does. So many people know and remember very vividly the volatility we had over the last sort of 3 years. So we saw very low prices sort of in 2020 when the pandemic hit, because demand for energy sunk to a very low point. And then subsequently in 21, 22, and for most of 23, we're feeling the effects of the war in Ukraine. So that's the historical side of things, but what's the outlook? Well, GridBeyond, we use a sophisticated AI-driven platform to forecast wholesale price scenarios 25 years ahead. This chart goes out 10 years, admittedly. The red line here shows basically a high price forecast of around about £200 a megawatt hour, and the low comparatively shows a low view of where prices could go, £35 a megawatt hour. The purple line there is actually indicative of, roughly speaking, where a 5 or 10 year, what we call pay as produced solar or onshore wind PPA would be valued at, so £60 a megawatt hour. Now, visually, that looks to be good value, and it's especially apparent when you consider that versus where prices have been only 2 years ago, and also if you compare that line versus the top line, the red line, there seems to be an awful lot of upside risk there, and comparatively quite a little amount of downside opportunity. Next slide, please. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm going to just throw some questions out. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the answers right now, but I'm hoping as part of the discussion we can get into more of these. But there are a number of considerations you should think about when securing or entering into negotiation for CPPA. So firstly, think about what kind of technology might suit you. So the images on the right hand side give an indication of some of the different types of sources out there. There might be ones in particular which have a profile benefit to you in terms of the shape of the generation that fits in better with your business, or maybe there's a brand benefit there as well. So you might see some align better with, say, hydro than anaerobic digestion. Again, underline the point there, you need to have 100% REGO coverage. Things like energy from waste, for example, don't come with 100% REGOs. They're not naturally 100% green, so it's an important distinction there. And again, the point on profiles, layering multiple PPAs together, especially from, say, like wind and solar sources, will synergize. So there's actually a profile benefit there as well. From a volume point of view, you'll ask yourself what level of volume you're aiming for. This is part of a multifaceted solution, no doubt. If it's your first corporate PPA, you may want to start small and maybe go at 10%. So you get comfortable with the idea, the concept. A key consideration also to factor in is who manages the volume risk. So I mentioned pay as produced earlier on, which is basically where the buyer pays for everything that the generator produces. There's no interference beyond that. That means the prices will be cheaper, but ultimately the balance of risk will favour the seller, the generator, over the buyer. Other models exist, such as baseload, where the seller will try to make available a certain shape, which will be desirable to the offtake of the buyer, but that will come with more risk to the seller and also a slight increase in the premium on the price of the PPA. And then finally, as mentioned earlier on, it's important to recognise that if you're going for a sleeved corporate PPA, you need to have capacity in your import agreement. In terms of term, one thing I should establish is the term of CPPAs tends to be roughly 10 to 15 years as a sort of starting point. However, over time, as markets mature, the tenor is coming down. And if you are considering going for a brand new build, which will be a big project, the developer will need to guarantee the return on investment, then it's likely to be 10, 15 years. So if additionality, which is what that means, is important to you, you may have to consider going for a 10, 15-year deal. However, when those sort of contracts have ended, those sort of sites may be interested in doing something shorter and capitalising on the market. And additionally, smaller sites, which may not have the ability or the leverage to go for longer term deals, may also be willing to offer shorter term contracts, such as 5 years or under. Next slide, please. Importantly, price. You need to understand, actually, is the price you're getting a good value? So again, we do forecasts. It's important to get hold of the forecasts to understand, actually, what is the forward view and does that price look attractive? And also, is it worth having that price locked in for the long term? If that price is a slight premium to the market, then you may see inherent value in that. Credit's a key one. You need to also consider what the credit requirements are put on you as a buyer. The key ones, for example, are an investment grade letter of credit or a parent company guarantee. Both can be quite onerous, so it's important to understand, can you fulfill them, or are there other avenues you can explore? And the final one, which applies more to virtual PPAs, again, specialist accounting treatment is required. There is because of the strike price reconciliation, an inherent risk around P&L volatility, where you have that movement every month and one party is paying the other. And then finally, you need to be aware of the fact that due to the fact that it's a financial derivative, you do need to actually report on this sort of contract. And then the last slide, please, Chloe. And this just wraps up the benefits overall. So clearly, as Gareth very well established at the start of the call, corporate PPAs can have a very substantial impact on your Scope 2 emissions reporting and your journey to net zero. If you are looking for additionality, as I think Joy will mention shortly in a moment with her slides, then this is actually a key vehicle for investing in brand new types of technology. They're portable deals, so you can take them with you to any supply arrangement on the import side. And also importantly, as we've said before, it gives you direct access to the guarantees of origin. From a seller point of view, clearly having a creditworthy counterparty buying the energy for a medium or long-term period is going to be immensely valuable to them. It may actually mean that the project can get built. Additionally, it will be a route for them for the long term to sell their power and guarantees of origin. And then finally, just some points kind of tease out again at the bottom. Again, corporate PPA provides a long-term clear price mechanism for price and also volume. And additionally, there's a great opportunity to use a corporate PPA to market it, give you enhanced sustainability credentials, greater brand recognition, and also marketable to customers and shareholders. That's the end of my bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. So this is the point where, thank you, Chloe, for moving over to those slides. This is the point where I am going to take you through AstraZeneca's net zero journey and what we're doing to support our net zero ambitions, and ultimately what we're trying to do right by people, planet, and society. So, Chloe, if you can go on to the next slide, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. So AstraZeneca have actually chosen to take a bold kind of decision to take direct action in this area because climate change is recognised as having a really strong connection between healthy planet and healthy people. So I think with that in mind, we acknowledge the fact that climate change has an increasing level of ill health and includes a rise in chronic conditions for people. So with that in mind, AstraZeneca have chosen to lead in this position from a healthcare perspective, and we understand that as a healthcare provider we present significant contribution to climate change as a rule, and actually what we're responsible for as an industry is about 5% global greenhouse gases as an industry, as a pharmaceutical industry. So I think with that in mind, what we try to understand here is where does that impact AstraZeneca from what we're doing every day, what our operations are taking to deliver every day, and what does it take to make our medicine. So We're on track effectively to reduce our green gas emissions, I should say, from our global operations for scope 1 and 2. So I'm just going to go through both areas here to start with scope 1 and 2 and into scope 3. And what we're aiming to do is reduce scope 1 and 2 by 98% by 2026 from our 2015 baseline. We're also one of the first 7 companies to have net zero scope 1 to 3 targets that have been verified under the scientific based targets initiatives, net zero corporate standards. Gareth, you spoke about this a little bit earlier on today, and as being a wide marker to measure yourself against, and then we've chosen to align ourselves with that because we feel it follows science and it's well and truly the right way into achieving decarbonisation. We're also one of the first pharmaceutical companies to sign up to all 3 of the following group climate change initiatives. We've been founding members of RE100 and gold standards RE100 for renewable energy for electricity and heat since 2015. We intend to maximise our transition to electric vehicles. We're also members of EP100, which effectively will talk about reducing the absolute energy use and double our energy productivity compared to the 2015 baseline. And I think the really important things to also acknowledge here is that there's a lot of work to be done in scope 3. So with that in mind, we aim to halve our entire value chain footprint by 2030. We're on the way to a 90% reduction by 2045 from the 2019 baseline. So by 2030, we will become carbon negative for remaining emissions at that point. And the big key takeaway here is to acknowledge that 95% of our supplier partners should have scientific-based targets by the end of 2025. We're aiming to transition to the next generation of respiratory products with near zero climate impact on propellants. And we're actually trying to design, we're designing in sustainability across product life cycles to embed net zero into the cost of goods going forward. Next slide, please, Chloe. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of that transition and truly understanding what our carbon footprint and how it's made up and how that translates into scope 1, 2 and 3. So I think to consider that, I think, you know, what we've tried to do here is truly understand that there's a greater challenge, shall we say, in trying to get from where we are to where we'd like to go in scope 3. In a moment, I'm going to walk you through scope 1 and scope 2, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we really need to acknowledge here is when we think about what's readily available in industry and to address supply chain access and infrastructure constraints, we increase the focus on energy efficiency and on-site renewables and strengthen the internal energy reduction targets. But we actually invested over £26 million through our Natural Resource Efficiency Fund, together with our central capital investments, to make sure that we can deliver on scope 1 and 2. But I'm just going to very quickly take you through the scope 3 journey, because if you're truly serious about net zero and getting to that position, let's just acknowledge scope 3. So if we go to the next slide, because 97% of our emissions come from scope 3, and I think we had to acknowledge that we needed to support our suppliers in this area to actually be part of the solution, to support them in decarbonising their supply chain as well, and what, you know, the indirect emissions that affect us in that way. So I think one of the big things that we can talk to here is that we are founder members of the Energyst programme and the Activate and My Green Lab coverage as well. We're also leading members of the SMI, which is effectively the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is chaired by our CEO, Pascal Soriot. And both these initiatives are effectively aim to accelerate the transition to a sustainable market by supporting the build of sustainable futures, promoting investments in technologies, and encouraging best practice for environmental and society well-being. The Energyst programme is open to our entire supply base in terms of being able to participate in PPA programmes. We're members with other large pharmaceuticals where you can participate in cohorts to support bringing in PPAs to decarbonise your electricity requirements. And obviously Neil and Gareth have talked to us a little bit about that. But I think if we can go on to the next slide, let's talk about some of the successes that we've had in this area, because I think it's really important that we acknowledge that by being part of the solution and being part of the change that we want to see, there are amazing things can be achieved when we work together. So when we look at the carbon reduction aspect of things. Over 50% of our spend is committed to scientific-based targets. And from that perspective, 700 suppliers are also participating so far with CDP, with primary emissions of 40% of supplier spend. So that effectively means in 2023 we achieved 50% against that 70% target. So we're doing really well in there. And in 2023 we set a target of 25% of spend to provide usable primary data through the CDP, and we've actually achieved 40% with that 750 or so actually signing up to CDP. The other side of this, I think, also to acknowledge is from an green energy usage perspective and the Energize program. In 2023, we achieved over 2 terawatts of electricity demand through Europe and North America, where there were about 500 suppliers recruited into those programs so that we can actually move in the direction to decarbonising their energy supply chains. And finally, on this particular slide, I wanted to talk about embedding best practice and what we're doing with the EcoVadis program. So to do this and to work with suppliers to educate and embed best practice, working alongside EcoVadis, whose sustainability impact is based on documented evidence, we effectively want all our suppliers to register for assessments. And in 2023, we set a target of 70% of spend to be rated by EcoVadis, with 65% over 45-point score. We basically met both of those targets, and we're talking at the moment of 1,500 suppliers rated for environmental governance. I think that's a tremendous achievement in such a short space of time, and we're really proud of the work that our colleagues are doing in this area and the supply chain that have signed up so far. So that's really what I wanted to say about scope 3. I think really the next part really is to concentrate on scope 1 and 2, because obviously that's the purpose of this webinar. So if we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So taking you through our journey from 2026 through to 2045, and ultimately being able to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions by 98% will mean us moving to 100% renewable energy by 2026. But one of the ambitions really, which is not the easiest one to deliver, which we're finding is interesting in industry, is to deliver against a 50% additionality with high quality certificates. So what that effectively means is not taking from existing projects in the grid, whether they be solar or wind, but actually providing new and additional sources of renewable energy into grids where we produce our medicines. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I'll talk you through what products or other projects that we're working on there. Scope 3, we've covered a significant amount here, and emissions to be reduced by 50% from the 2019 baseline. But actually this goes on into 2045, and the fact that we are going to also be making sure that we remove residual emissions through nature-based solutions to achieve scientific-based zero at that point. So if we can go on to the next slide, this is where we hone in specifically on scope 1 and 2. Now, this particular slide is an interesting one because it shows you the trajectory and the journey that we've been on since 2015, with AstraZeneca, where, as you can see from the very far left-hand side, it's very heavily fossil fuel based in our generation mix. We do have some element of green tariffs and some renewable energy certificates purchases, but they were low quality, and in essence there was a massive area where we could improve in this area to deliver that gradual and sustained trajectory towards net zero. So if we fast forward a few years into 2022, you can see that we've increased our renewable energy fuel mix with a 1% additionality, and a mix of quality certificates. And you can see how we've also introduced on-site solar PV and some PPAs into here. We've increased our green tariff requirements, and we've kind of been including additional certificates, whether they be unbundled at this point, to ensure that our imported energy is of green renewable sources. But if we then fast forward a few years onto 2026, as per our ambitions and the targets that we publicised, we are headed towards 100% renewable energy by 2026, and we are on target to meet our 50% additionality with a significant shift towards high quality certificates. And I think the key thing here to take from this is about, in fact, impactful, intentional and purpose-driven ways of working so that we decarbonise our energy requirements here at AstraZeneca, so we can be part of the future that we want to see. If we can just go on to the next slide, I'll now talk you through the actual projects that we've been working on to give you an idea of how that actually looks. So from a Scope 1 perspective, we've done as much as we can, and we're still to this day, and we will continue to work on optimization and reduction, energy reduction programs in our Scope 3 and natural gas consumptions. It doesn't just include natural gas. We do talk about F-gases and making sure that we're responsible in that area, but where this directly attributes to our utilities, we have actually looked at electrification projects and how we can move away from using gas in certain areas and potentially moving that consumption into electricity. But one of our key areas and key areas of deliverables is around our gas purchase agreements. So you may have seen out in the public domain, we've got some gas purchase agreements for renewable natural gas, and predominantly these tend to be new to grid, and they are all in fact new to grid, but where we've tried to be leading in industry is actually to try and have sleeved gas purchase agreements into retail contracts. Now, to my knowledge, they are first of a kind. We've worked very, very hard at AstraZeneca to make sure that we can demonstrate the traceability through supply chain. We've recently, as you can see, publicised the deals with Vanguard Renewables in the US and with Future Biogas in the UK. And the most recent one since the new year is the collaboration we have with China Resource Gas and Everbright, which means, my colleagues in China have been doing a fabulous job of actually putting in something that really means it's going to make a big difference to their journey. Now, the other side of this is Scope 2, and this is where squarely PPAs come into the mix. And once we've understood our usage and we've optimized and we've brought in all our energy reduction programs, we are sourcing renewable energy from solar and wind projects that are new to grid, and this is where the additionality aspect that Neil spoke about is really key for us, because we want to be part of the change to actually be a solution to the problem. Because if you continuously take from existing grid activities, it doesn't really fix the issue. So we're trying to decarbonize our products and where we operate. So that's where going forward we're going to commit to putting in new projects and actually facilitating and underpinning the financing of these projects to make them so that our products are decarbonised as they come through. Now, we've got one project in Sweden that's already underway. Statkraft have got one of them. We're currently working on the UK and the US PPAs at the moment, and we'll confirm more of those in the future. But I think we still have space, and there is still in our strategy a space for high quality certificates that we can actually ensure that we can trace all the way through the supply chain to ensure that they are of the highest of standards. We don't want to be associated with any form of greenwashing, so we will continue to stand by the RE100 expectations, and we will continue to ensure that geographical relevance, temporal relevance and additionality continue to meet that criteria. And the other thing that we're recently actually looking into, and if I'm honest, we're going some inroads, is to making sure that 24/7 matching is another area that we're trying to ensure that that we keep and we include as part of our specification, to be able to stand by everything we've said we're going to do in industry. So that is very much what AstraZeneca are doing in terms of renewable energy procurement activities, and that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Ambition Zero Carbon and what we're doing at AstraZeneca. And there we go. That's the last part of my area. Tim, I think that's back to you, isn't it, at this point?
Yes, thank you, John. Really good.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you also, Gareth. Neil, if you can all join me now. The Q&A is beginning now, so do please get over any more questions. I know some of you already have, and actually I'll start with one here. We'll just get straight into it. So this one's actually says, I've had people asking to cover 100% of their demand with PPAs, and if you do a solar PPA, this is just not viable. And two, if we need lots of PPAs, how should rules and practices change to allow more customers to participate? So there's two questions there. But essentially, the first one, 100%, especially if you were doing solar, how could you possibly? Neil, Gareth, maybe.
So first, I'll take the first part of that question. I think first of all, it's important to recognise you can do this in blocks. So when we say 100%, not only can you target 100% or as much as possible, shall we say, because 100% is very difficult in practice, you can do that over a number of agreements and solutions too. So I did lean a little bit into the fact that you can have, for example, a couple or more complementary corporate PPAs which have a sort of a synergizing effect. So wind and solar work quite well together. So actually things like that can actually support you with actually getting to the right level in terms of your profile. Gareth, I mean, battery storage, that would help too, wouldn't it, thinking about it?
Yeah, well, that kind of ties in nicely with the 24/7 power matching piece that Joy mentioned as well. So it's, you know, it's I think I touched on it on one of my slides about getting the right mix of PPA, so a mixture of wind and solar, for example, to meet what your site demand and profile is as well. But batteries are going to play an increasingly large part in that shift, and as there's a move towards like that need for granularity over where your power and when your power is being produced is going to be key in reaching your goals and the transition to net zero as well.
Actually, just to follow up on that, someone said, what's the role of, because you're talking about storage, the role of storage to reduce the cost of PPAs is how can that factor in?
Yeah, there's kind of two areas on this, and I don't know whether Neil, you might be able to chime in if it's front of meter. So there's two types of storage that we refer to in the industry, Tim, and it's either front of meter or behind the meter energy storage. Now, when I'm referring to behind the meter storage and reducing the cost of PPAs, batteries are very useful because they can, if you have an on-site PPA, it can act as a solar sponge. So therefore you can, what we've seen in the market is consumers be able to oversize solar systems now, rather than have to worry about feeding into the grid, which is a whole other issue in itself as well. Not only is it really cost prohibitive or not very cost attractive, there's also issues in the volumes that you can actually export. So what a battery can do is sit alongside, and we can, or consumers can co-locate battery and solar storage, and the battery acts as a solar sponge. And then during the time when the site demand outstrips what the energy being produced from the solar system, i.e. at night, might be doing, the battery will then disperse and discharge into the site, allowing the consumer to not just use green energy, but also, if they're paying a cheaper PPA price than grid energy, actually utilize that lower cost as well. Neil, for front of meter,
I'd probably offer one suggestion. I'm looking at something at the moment along the lines of this. It's a co-located project, which is a solar farm with a battery storage system, and we're looking at actually how can the developer best use that battery for effectively finding a counterparty and signing a corporate PPA with them. So I think that there's something in around solar's got a profile to it. It might not necessarily be advantageous because it's not always producing at the right times, but the battery can help to manage some of that profile risk, as it would be, and it might actually also potentially reduce the amount of imbalance as well. So I mentioned imbalance earlier on, which is the difference between effectively what you're expecting to buy or need versus actually what that variable plant is producing. So again, that battery will be there to soak up some of that imbalance as well.
Here's what do you mean by hedging here, as in CPA to act as a hedge? Do you mean a financial hedge?
Joy, do you want to go for that one?
So your PPA at that particular point, Tim, effectively acts as a long-term price agreement to agree a price ahead, which, let's face it, right, prior, actively hedging in advance of what you're going to consume is taking a price point and agreeing to pay it further into the future. The PPA allows you to agree in advance for a future point where you're going to consume it at that particular price. So to some extent, PPAs provide you with some price stability to some extent that effectively means you could treat it as a long-term hedge in that respect.
Here's I'm not sure who this is for, but how many UK suppliers are accepting pay-as-produced power?
Good question.
Capitals, so pay-as-produced. Yeah.
So in terms of buying their own, doing their own PPAs effectively.
I assume so.
Yeah, or it is might be from the corporate angle of sleeving the volume in as well. So I worked with a supplier in my last job actually, so I have a fair bit of experience of this. I think every contract we were involved with was pairs produced. I think it's important to recognise as well, especially for the prestigious projects, which are again presenting additionality, brand new, very attractive. They will have a lot of leverage. The developer will do so, and often they're doing these projects at a reasonable amount of pace as well, so they don't have time to mess about. So what they'll do is they'll try and find the most cost-effective and the best form of agreement, and obviously from the volume side of things, the best fit there as well, which then will be pairs produced. They'll probably lean into that, and if somebody can't agree to that, then they'll probably find somebody else who can.
Right. These are a couple of questions actually for Joy here. How does AstraZeneca procure PPAs directly from generator or via a supplier or middleman? And 2, is there a plan stroke timeline for AstraZeneca to adopt 24/7 matching as it is more costly approach?
Both very good questions. So let me take the first one. We like to be quite holistic really at AstraZeneca, because it just depends, because obviously don't forget we've got a significant jurisdictional coverage here, our main hubs, and a significant proportion of our consumption are in Sweden, UK and the US. And I think you can't just have one cookie cutter that fits all. You have to be realistic in terms of what's achievable across each jurisdiction, because each jurisdiction has its own challenges, and actually, you know, what products and what availability there are and how you contract in these mechanisms plays a really big part. We're quite happy to talk directly to generators. We are quite happy to work directly through some of our suppliers. We've got some significant conversations going on there. But also, do you know what? We're part of the Energize program. We do have an opportunity to participate in those cohorts alongside some of our large farmers. And we have the opportunity at that point to demonstrate that many of the programs that we've got are really fantastic opportunities in their own right. So it's a mix. There isn't just necessarily one way of working, and we have to assess each opportunity as it comes. The second part of your question was in and around 24/7. So for us, that's something we've been keeping an eye on for quite some time, trying to understand what jurisdictionally is available. It's interesting to understand some of the restrictions in some areas, some of the opportunities in some areas where we can get that. We're finding that there are some suppliers that can do more than others. And in addition to that, many of them are claiming that they can do 24/7 is because they're actually including nuclear generation, which is a carbon-free renewable energy in its own right. Well, it's not renewable, is it? It's carbon-free, but the principle here is that it's not renewable. So from that perspective, AstraZeneca has taken quite a firm position. We will not accept nuclear generation as part of our generation mix, and we are seeking to find that solution to support 24/7. I'm not going to sit here and say we have everything absolutely sewn up and we've got it all right, but we are striving towards being able to demonstrate greater transparency and credibility in this area, and we are working really hard to get that right.
This question might be more for the GridBeyond, but I'll just ask you first, Joy, do you think the price is reasonable that you've been paying, as in market?
Well, it's a good question, and I think that's very subjective to the organisation that's making that decision ultimately, isn't it? Because from that perspective, if you're going to go out and make certain claims out in industry, you want to be able to, you get to decide whether you feel that that's reasonable enough or not reasonable, as the case may be, and actually what value is that to you as an organisation to be able to stand by the claims that you're making. So I think AstraZeneca have their position, but I can't. That's not one to answer for everybody. Everybody gets to make that call for themselves.
Yeah, this is the full question. Can you please tell me more about how current PPA prices compare to current forward prices and forecasts in the UK? Is there a business case for PPAs being more likely to be about price certainty rather than getting a cheaper price? Which I think,
Neil, that's probably a better one for you and on that front, isn't it? Because you've got access to more of that.
Well, it's a £1 million question, isn't it? Is that the best price you'll get? Can I do better? I mean, inevitably there'll be some people who think I'll try my luck in the short-term market and see if I can get a benefit there. And you may well do, but of course it's quite risky, isn't it? And I think what the last sort of 2-3 years has shown us is the market can reach unfathomable levels. We can see extreme volatility there, both on the downside and the upside as well. So we're not saying that you have to put all all the regs in one basket. Again, I think a layered approach is what we were recommending before. And it feels, as someone's worked in procurement, so Joy's sat at the table for quite a while, it feels like £60, roughly speaking, for something with all the benefits of the corporate PPA, which is not just price alone, of course, is quite attractive. But I can understand how maybe compared to 5 years ago, it wouldn't be that attractive back then. But I think we're in a different world now. So yeah, so I think, yeah, a long-term hedge is probably sensible. And you've got to make your own mind up if that's something you're willing to stick to.
Here's one for Gareth. It says, Gareth, are BTM batteries allowed to charge from the grid during low prices to offset grid consumption at high prices? Presumably charging off spill underutilises the battery in winter. No solar in brackets.
I think I got most of that question, particularly maybe not just quite at the end. Obviously, I mean, solar, one of the, not hindrance per se, but the solar profile or output profile and how it complements wind is that they're opposites. You know, there's more power produced by solar in the summer than there is winter, and vice versa with wind. But with with battery and solar, yes, obviously, simple arbitrage is one way of getting that battery to work for you, but there are multiple other ways that battery can work for a business, i.e. it can soak up overspill of solar to you, so it can increase your sustainability credentials, but also having that asset and capacity on site, it opens up other markets for you, and grid frequency and frequency response markets. So there's that asset that you can have can generate revenue for the business. It can increase the maximum import capacity, which is a challenge that lots of companies have as well. It creates or provides resiliency for consumers. So in terms of what a battery can do for a business, it's not simple kind of arbitrage or solar storing. Yes, it is one of the benefits, but there are multiple others. And I think it's a really important point that consumers consider when looking at battery technology is this kind of multi-pronged approach of what that asset can mean for your business outside of solar storage or price arbitrage.
We've got here, how can you ensure REGOs aren't used twice? I mean, is there a retirement process audited?
Well, I'll put that question if I may do. So they have a unique reference number. They are unique in principle. Because I asked this question, is there such a thing as REGO fraud a long time ago? The answer is no, because effectively they have a unique reference number, and that will reference back to the source of origin. Because again, it's guarantee of origin, isn't it? So.
Here's the government UK government's data shows that there are no new solar PV projects greater than 25 megawatts installed since May 2023. Is there really a market for new solar PV?
Yeah, I believe so. The biggest challenge that we see is not a lack of businesses wanting to install, obviously, but a lack of capacity available on the grid. You know, some of our connections, grid connection offers from DNOs come in 2030, 2032. I think we had a recent company goal or record rather of 2035, for example. So I think it's important that consumers, and again, this kind of coincides with what a battery can offer businesses, but when businesses consider solar, it's really important. One of the key aspects outside of having roof space is making sure that it's sized correctly. And, you know, again, back to my original point, one of the key challenges that we see is the volumes of energy being fed back into the grid need to be minimal for a project to be considered from the DNO side. How you can circumnavigate that and get around it is if you can co-locate energy storage that will basically offer a layer of protection almost, if you like, from the grid side, and the DNO is more likely to allow that to be connected.
We're running out of time. I will ask a couple more questions, but if your questions didn't get asked, I'll hand it over to the panel after the session, and I'm sure they'd be happy to contact you with answers. Anyway, this is one that says, how do you treat Scope 3 emissions with the PPA? Is that possible?
George, do you want to go for that one? Because I know you've got a big Scope 3 target, haven't you?
So scope 3 emissions predominantly are in your supply chain. So ultimately what that means is making sure that your supply chain, which effectively means their scope 1 and 2 is your scope 3. So let's make sure that what we're doing here, and you know, I spoke a little bit earlier about AstraZeneca's scope 3 program and what we're doing with the Energize program and the SMI to actually support our suppliers to help them find ways of getting access and gaining access to sustainable technologies like PPAs to actually help them do that. So I think from that perspective, that's where making sure that, you know, your supplier's scope 1 and 2 has an impact on you from a scope 3 perspective, and that's hence why the supply chain and the whole loop sort of starts again. So where you're taking active engagement in marketplace to put PPAs, or in our case GPAs as well, in place, ultimately it's engaging with the right partners and making sure that you've got the right retail mechanisms to adopt PPAs, and that's certainly the mechanisms that we've chosen here at AstraZeneca to support additionality and ensure that we've got the right renewable energy credentials to decarbonise.
And lastly, I'll ask the last one. Where does the PPA fixed price come from? For example, £60 mentioned earlier. Is it set by the generator supplier based on the market rate / negotiable? Are they usually fixed and then influenced by this CPI?
All of the above, actually. So yeah, the market is still maturing. So we don't quite have, like we do with more traditional import wholesale power, a sort of public index that everyone can see. Indexes do exist. I know one or two parties are trying to have a go at establishing indexes. It tends to be, to begin with, it's a price, an aspirational price that the developer or generator will need, because they will have a levelized cost of energy to hit, which basically means they need a certain level or above to make that project happen. That's a key thing there. CPI is a tool that many developers look to use. One thing I would say about that is it might enable you to strike a price which is a little bit cheaper at the front end, but of course the developer will make some money back over the term of the contract as the CPI is compounded over the 5, 10, 15 years. However, it is all up for negotiation. I'm also working with a developer at the moment who are quite happy to do a flat price and just be done with it. Okay.
Well, as I say, I will pass the questions on, and the presentation will be available to you shortly. You'll all be emailed. So thank you so much for listening today, everyone. And thank you for Joy, Neil and Gareth for such interesting presentations.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Thanks. Bye-bye.